Hello and welcome back to this downplayed Idealistic Crusade. Today I'm talking about the Warner Archive release of their new scan and presentation of the 1941 MGM remake of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which of course was, rather infamously I should say, a direct remake of the 1931 Paramount Frederick March starring version directed by Ruben Mamoulian. And this is one of the films where, due to MGM deciding to remake a past hit from another studio, they bought the rights to not just the remake, but also the rights to the earlier hit version, and then tried to not only suppress it, but actually lock copies away and destroy as many print elements as they could. They would do this a number of times, and it's one of the most disreputable, dishonorable, and worst studio practices that existed in classic Hollywood that some other studios would do. It wasn't just MGM, but MGM seemed to be a big progenitor of this, and this is one of the primary cases. Of course, this film was made during the enforcement of the production code, so while it is remaking the 1931 version, which itself was spawned out of wanting to remake the silent version, you could technically call this 1941 adaptation really the sort of second remake of the silent version, if you really want to look at the sort of remake status, because it does draw directly from the 20 silent version with John Barrymore, and all three draw very heavily from the Thomas Stevenson stage play version, so they do differ greatly from Robert Louis Stevenson's original novella. What most people say or come away with when they see the 41 version is you can't help but compare it to the 1931 Mamoulian version with Frederick March, and it does automatically come away, you come away with the feeling that the 41 version is inferior because it's not anywhere near as dark or morbid or grisly or maliciously gleeful as the 31 version, which is one of the primary pre-code Hollywood examples of how amazingly dark and wonderfully just completely carefree pre-code films could be. Then the 31 Jekyll and Hyde is one of, I think, the immortal examples, and one of those first films that you should put people in front of if they've never seen a pre-code film and they're curious about it, or if you really just want them to shut up from saying that black and white films are boring and old movies are boring, and you show them the 31 Jekyll and Hyde and they shut up real fast. Because they're not prepared for what that film is about to unleash upon them. The 41 version, to say that it plays it safe is an understatement. And when you watch these films in close order, or especially back to back, if you were to watch the 31 and 41 versions, it's going to be glaringly obvious how much of an inferior experience the 41 version is, because it's basically the 31 version but with all the teeth pulled out. It has no real bite to it, and they also, it's being made at MGM, where Louis B. Mayer wanted everything to be in sort of happy, perfect land, like it was an Andy Hardy movie. So, not exactly where you would picture Jekyll and Hyde being done as a serious adaptation. Of course, the original idea was to do their own fresh interpretation and it be very psychological based, and have MGM's greatest critically acclaimed thespian actor, Spencer Tracy, attack the role. And that seems like a fantastic match made in heaven, because there had been certain points in other films, and of course his stage career, where he had played characters with such internalized anger and repressed emotion that sometimes erupt to the surface. I think the biggest example would be the MGM 1936 masterpiece that Fritz Lang directed, Fury, which is one of Tracy's best performances and best films, also in a must-own disc from the Warner Archive. So the idea of Tracy getting to do Jekyll and Hyde is really an irresistible idea. So I think you can see why it was decided that this might be a perfect vehicle for Tracy's talents. And he himself was interested and excited to try this, and the original idea was to have been a very psychological version of the story, a completely new script and a new take on the material. But that didn't really always, generate excitement in the studio brass in Hollywood. And when you have a proven thing, you have a proven hit, the idea was to usually try and imitate that a little ways down the road, or just out and out remake it. And MGM started this practice of buying the rights to successful hits, remaking them a couple years or even sometimes a decade later, but not just remaking them to try and replace the original hit film in the public's mind, but to also literally try to bury the original so no one would remember it, or if they did, they would have no access to it because it was no longer in circulation or in existence. And probably the worst case of this was when they remade Gaslight a couple years later in 1944. And while the George Cukor directed version is a classic and extremely well made and beautiful to look at, it was shot by the same cinematographer, Joseph Rutenberg, who shot this version of Jekyll and Hyde, which has the full MGM gloss, so it always looks beautiful. But with Gaslight, they actually did destroy the original negative, and the only way that film survived was the fact that the director of that film actually managed to spirit a copy of the negative away and get a copy made and then return it before people realized that he had done this. And so decades later, he was finally able to say that, hey, I actually have a copy I made. I have it locked in a bank vault. So that's how we have the original version of Gaslight to survive, and it is the better film because it's much grittier. It's much more suspense-driven. It's much more. It's more earthy. It's more believable, and it's again the same situation here with Jekyll and Hyde. So here you have a beautifully mounted MGM high-gloss production with a phenomenal cast of people who were, at the time, under contract at MGM. You have Spencer Tracy attacking the dual role of Jekyll and Hyde in a more psychological manner. But it feels like a sort of empty exercise, unfortunately, because it's basically redoing the 31 film, but with all of the sexual undercurrents stripped out, all of the pre-code material stripped out. Everything is softened to such a point that with the film's longer runtime, because it is about 2 hours, 7 minutes long, it feels quite empty, unfortunately. There are places where it does seem like there's just not a whole lot going on, and there's not a whole lot of transformation sequences either. All of what would be considered the more grisly aspects are toned down, and so it more frequently resembles a costume drama. But even though the photography is beautiful and has the full MGM high gloss and a large, lavish budget, you can also tell that when they're going around the city streets, particularly when Hyde is doing his infamous runs down the streets of London in his cloak and top hat, as happens in all versions of the story, you can tell that it's a backlot. It's not shadowy in the way that the 31 version is. It's not suggesting atmosphere in that way. So there isn't any point where you don't doubt this is an MGM picture. If you know anything about studio house styles, this has MGM stamped all over it. The film was directed by the legendary Victor Fleming, who does his usual fantastic job. So it's not to say that this film is bad, because I do think that Fleming's direction, Tracy's performance, and the MGM high gloss and some of the other things are worth the watch. But unfortunately, you can never escape the fact that this film is redoing the 1931 version, but without any of its bite or impact. So you have to look really hard, or much harder, for elements to pick up on and like and enjoy. And it all comes down to the fact that they should have just started from scratch like they were doing originally. When they decided to remake the 31 version, it really bummed Tracy out, and he knew he was going to be compared to Frederick March. And when the film came out, and it did okay, but nobody really thought it was that great. And instantly, the first thing they did was compare it to Frederick March's performance in the 1931 film. And everybody said, even at the time, that the MGM remake came up short, which, it's pretty obvious, because all you have to do is watch 5 minutes of this picture, and this film literally starts in a church during service. So I don't know how much more MGM of an opening for this film you could possibly have than everyone in a church service singing hymns. It doesn't really seem like how you would open a Jekyll and Hyde story. So again, this film, I think the strengths it has, when you have to really dig into it, I think the strengths of it are the fact that it's actually pulling a bit more from the 1920 version. This is trying to make Jekyll much more of a saintly character like the Barrymore interpretation was in the silent version. I think there's a much more distinct flavor of tragedy here, because Jekyll here in Tracy's performance is the dedicated scientist who only wants to help mankind and is, for lack of a better term, the sort of goody two-shoes and noble character that we see in the 1920 version. Whereas in the 1931 version, that is very much dialed down, and it seems much more that Jekyll is extraordinarily repressed by Victorian society. You get that in all three versions, but only the silent 20 version and the MGM 1941 version really go for Jekyll, the saint type character, and that highlights his tragic downfall. Everything else in terms of the story beats is exactly the same from the 31 version, but severely watered down. We're introduced to the two female characters, the idea that they mirror sort of the two sides of Jekyll. So once again, he has the love interest that he wants to marry, but her father is a bit more, obviously an intelligent person who says, no, you need to wait a little bit, and that frustration causes Jekyll to throw himself into his work and then, be an idiot and experiment on himself. But here, it's harder to even get on Jekyll's side with this, because the father's played by the wonderful Donald Crisp, and he seems so wonderful and nice. So it doesn't really have any of the sort of antagonism that's in the 31 version, even though that sort of character dynamic is very light there as well. The love interest is played by Lana Turner, and the switch, the notable thing most people might know about this film is that the two actresses are playing against type. So Lana Turner is playing the sort of angelic good girl figure that Jekyll wants to marry, and Ingrid Bergman winds up playing the Ivy character this time around, and she apparently actually requested to play Ivy to try and avoid her usual typecasting, to show that she had greater range. And I think the film is all the better for it. I think Lana Turner is actually pretty good in the sort of good girl role, but she's not given anything to do other than just stand around and look sad. And it's really a thankless part in all the versions that are based on the stage play. Again, I've never been a fan of the love interests and all the stuff the stage play introduced to Stevenson's original story. So it's really a thankless part. But Ingrid Bergman, like Miriam Hopkins in the 1931 version, is a real standout, and you need Ivy to be a strong presence in this type of telling of being based on the stage play. When you have this sort of love triangle between the mirrored opposites, Ivy has to be a stronger character. But this being production code enforced, she is no longer a prostitute, she's merely a barmaid. But you kind of forget about that, because the film is able to very easily gloss over that, and you forget that she's no longer a prostitute. I think one of the most striking things in this film is her performance, and how she's able to convey a lot of the same anxiety and fear and sexuality that Hopkins was able to convey in the 31 version. But here it has to be much more subdued and internalized, just like Tracy's performance. It's very psychological based. And the film does actually get to some sexual undercurrent. I think the biggest example of this is when Jekyll and Ivy first meet. It's nowhere near as overtly steamy and in-your-face sexual as the 31 version, with the direction and the performance, and of course the imagery. Here, you don't get that, but what you do get is very internalized sexuality that's expressed through sensuality. So I think in some ways, it's actually when Jekyll carries her to her back to her apartment, and they do the same sort of, oh, I'm actually a doctor, let me check you out. And of course, it's amusing that here on this Blu-ray, you can clearly see the wires that they used to hold Ingrid Bergman up. So when Tracy could carry her, because he had a bad back, he couldn't actually do that. So they couldn't hide it in the shot. And here on the Blu-ray, it's wonderfully amusing that you can actually clearly see the wires holding her up. but it's actually a more adult way of playing the scene, and they get in very close proximity, and you actually manage to get Victor Fleming gets across the same sort of sexual undercurrent and how this plays into Jekyll's subconscious, and if you view Hyde as his sort of unbridled id let loose into the world, it achieves the same effect. It's one of the best scenes in the film, and both Bergman and Tracy play it beautifully, but Bergman is unbelievably sensual in this scene, so she manages to get across the same extreme sexuality that's in the 31 version, but of course without putting it into words, which is what you had to do in the production code. So it's moments like that where the film really goes into the psychological side of the characters and the story. That's where it's at its strongest, and that's where it really works. This, of course, is at its foremost when Tracy is playing Hyde and all the Hyde scenes. They do have a bit of makeup, and they do have a transformation sequence that does resemble a little bit the first transformation in the 31 version, where that has the extreme camera pans, and that sort of devolves into all the figures in Jekyll's life devolving over the transformation sequence as you see a manifestation of what's happening to his psyche. Here in the 41 version, the transformation scene is much more about that sort of visual, and it turns into sort of like a nightmare dream sequence on steroids. It's very extraordinarily Freudian, which was, again, tying back to the whole original concept of this being a psychological approach. And you see some really interesting imagery with the two women representing, again, the two sort of sides of Jekyll and Hyde. And then when we see Tracy as Hyde, he does have some makeup, but it's much more minimal because, again, the idea is to convey that this is a psychologically based performance, an attack on the material. So while some people might say, oh, well, it still looks like Spencer Tracy, the idea is much more as it would be on the stage when you're doing Jekyll and Hyde, to convey the difference in character by performance and by sheer acting physical presence and just the intensity of the distinction between the characters, thus hides the fact that it's still obviously the same person. So they act so completely differently, and they carry themselves so differently that you would never even consider that they are the same person. So it's not as obvious a film in terms of it, because it's going for the psychological. So it becomes easier to look at Tracy's performance as simplistic on the surface. You have to really look at what he's doing, and in all honesty, it actually manages to be quite chilling, because you can see much more of Jekyll and Hyde, obviously, in this version as compared to the 31 version. So while Hyde in the 31 version becomes so monstrous in his deeds and the makeup degenerates, so he does become completely scary, here, the scary factor is still there, but it's much more internalized. And this Hyde is extraordinarily cold in the depravity of his actions. And he's much more, even more about controlling and dominating Ivy. And in that sense, it's actually more believable in a realistic sort of way. And it's just as chilling, but again, it's internalized. And Tracy's able to do things with just little small minute actions and what they might suggest, and you can see the unbridled emotions lurking beneath the surface. He seems to run almost entirely on a lust for life filled and fueled entirely by anger and primordial passions. And in the scenes where he's in Ivy's apartment that he's furnished for her, and she's basically now the bird in his gilded cage, the fear that's on Ingrid Bergman's face, and what Tracy's able to do with little actions like absentmindedly playing the piano, or particularly there's this bit where he grabs grapes and he just eats them, and then when he spits the actual pit out, it's like it's as vicious a move as if he had actually struck her. So the intensity of those scenes, of all the intimate scenes between particularly Jekyll, Hyde, and Ivy, are really something. And I think the standouts of the film, because Fleming is able to really direct those to the nines and show that he was one of the greatest directors of classic Hollywood. So it's unfortunate that, again, they didn't just go and do their own fresh adaptation, because it would have been a better film and it wouldn't have suffered the never-ending comparisons, because you can't not compare the two films, because this film is remaking the 31 version beat for beat and removing so much that it feels like it frequently has a bit of hot air. But it's so well put together and so well directed, and with the full MGM gloss, that when you watch it, you can get into the sort of flow of things, and it's still an enjoyable film to watch. No film is made with MGM top production values anymore. No film will ever be made like this again. So there is a sort of a trade-off. While the film is undeniably weaker and a lesser film than the 31 version it remakes, there are some strengths to it, and the production values are just, you'll find yourself stopping and marveling and just looking at them and realizing that no one makes films like this anymore, and no one ever will. But I think the real highlights are Tracy's performance, Bergman's performance, and of course Victor Fleming's direction. The photography is also excellent, and there is a really great Franz Waxman score, which is something that you don't really have in the 31 version, being a pre-code early talkie, where musical scores were still not really seen as something that were desirable for a full musical score for the film with character motifs and things. And when you have one of the greatest composers in film history doing a score, that obviously does tilt the scales a little bit in the 41 version's favor. It's a very good score. I wish there was more of it in the film, and I wish the film was better. But I do think the score is a nice enticement as well for going to the 41 version. So basically what I'm trying to say is, I don't think the 41 version is the complete waste most people try to make it out as. It is completely inferior to the film that it remakes. It was extraordinarily unfair, and I think an unbelievable dirty practice of MGM to try and destroy the original films they were remaking in order to make their version not only successful, but the only version in existence. I think that should have been made illegal, because I think that's absolutely insane and just unfathomable, especially from an archival and historical preservation standpoint to look at. But when you look at the 41 version, particularly on this new Warner Archive release, it's an enjoyable experience, actually. Even if you watch it back to back with the 31 version, if you can quickly put aside the fact that it's not going to be as effective, you can start to look at what its own individual strengths are, and some of the places where it does start to deviate. Again, they do really hammer home the idea that Jekyll is much more of a saintly character, and that his tragic downfall is not necessarily for his own personal gains, but because he's essentially sort of working as an early sort of analyst or psychologist, and that's what leads him into looking at the duality of man, because he wants to help people. Again, there are some direct lifts or sort of echoes of the 1920 Barrymore version, and like the Barrymore version, the Tracy performance isn't relying very heavily on makeup. It's much more about the performance, and I do think Tracy is magnificent in the film. I wish the film was better and was its own adaptation, so he could have really even reached greater heights with his performance. I don't think it's anything for him to have been embarrassed about. I think it's a magnificent performance. I think the limitations are in the script and the fact that it's being made at MGM instead of another studio who would have gotten full tilt into horror material. But of course, it's 1941, as World War II was really getting even more intensive, and of course the U.S. would enter the war at the end of the year. And you couldn't really make horror films in the way that you could, obviously, in the golden age of horror. It was at the time where Universal had only recently started making horror films again. And they were of a lighter variety in terms of they were nowhere near as grisly. And very quickly they transitioned over into being just B-film products at the new Universal. So aside from Son of Frankenstein and The Wolfman, all the other horror films that were being cranked out were designed to be B-movie product and not the A-tier gothic experiences of the 30s that were full of lurid pre-code goodness. So you could never make a Jekyll and Hyde at that time as intensive as the 31 version, but it would have been much better had they just gone for a fresh adaptation as originally planned and then built the strengths of that around what they had to cope with the production code. So, unfortunately, the film overall is a mixed bag. Some people do really enjoy it. There are some who do prefer it to the 31 version, and it's an interesting comparison to make because you can see two distinct eras of Hollywood represented by two distinct studio house styles between Paramount of the 30s in the pre-code days and MGM in the early 40s when they were at the height of their production powers, and the polar opposite of 30s Paramount. So I think it's a fascinating comparison. I think it's important to see both films. I think there are good strengths in the 41 version, and there are great performances, and of course, beautiful direction from the one and only Victor Fleming. So it's not a film to write off. It's not a film to just say, oh well, it's a sucky remake and it's not pre-code, so it's not worth watching. I do think it's worth watching. I think there are great strengths here, and seeing it this way on this beautiful Blu-ray really made me rediscover the film entirely, because I hadn't seen it in a long time, and I was really impressed by the best moments, particularly in Tracy and Bergman's performances, which are really fantastic. So to talk now about the Warner Archive Blu-ray, this is another of their new scans for 2022. They decided to do this, and then later on in the year release the 31 version, which of course required much more restoration work. Thankfully, the MGM version was not subjected to the same terrible fate as the 31 version. So this was a case of being able to do a new scan of best surviving elements. And to talk about the picture quality, this disc is an absolute beauty. This shows off, again, MGM high gloss production values to the nines. It is an easily it's a black and white demo title for sure, even though it's not 4K with HDR on a UHD disc. They could issue this on a UHD disc if I'm not sure what the resolution scan was for the source. I'm sure it was probably, I would think it's a 4K scan, but this disc does already rival 4K UHD titles for catalog black and white films because it's so well mastered. The only things you'll notice, there are one or two very, very faint moments where there seems to be a sort of, there's a tiny line that's trying to poke through on a close-up or two. I only noticed that really twice, and they were indistinct. They weren't complete lines. They were just very faintly sort of poking in there, but that may just be things that were not able to be removed because they were that much baked into the source. But those were very, very faint and fleeting in those two instances. There is also one tiny spot where there is a missing frame or two, but it might be intentional in terms of the actual editing of that scene. I'm not exactly sure, but I did notice that, and it looks so intrinsic to the source that it might just be a part of the original editing process, or it's just baked into the source itself and thus unavoidable. But that sort of stuff does happen occasionally, and there's nothing you can really do about it if it is missing in the source. The only real downside to this new picture restoration is, as is common with a lot of films when they face censor trouble with the production code, as this film did in the dream sequence in particular, there has been found and available in Germany, I believe it is, a sort of foreign export version that does have some of this material. So if you find this German version floating around, and there is photographic evidence of it online, it does contain some alternate takes and some additional footage in that dream sequence. And it runs a couple minutes longer, actually. So it's unfortunate that I guess Warner Archive was either unaware or unable to license this material from the German rights holders, but some of the cut footage, there is a alternate longer version of the film with a slightly different edit that's available on, I think it's been shown on German broadcast, much like what happened with the alternate footage in the slightly longer German version of Psycho that finally did get picked up by Universal in various ways. And this happens sometimes, and it's unfortunate that a lot of this stuff kind of gets buried or lost to time and is stuck only in, people having to tape it off of television airings. But I do wish that had been able to be included in this release, because I think it would be very important, even if they didn't or couldn't introduce it into their new high-res HD scan. to at least have that footage as an extra. I do think that would be very important. That's the one real drawback to this release, that they were not able or were not aware of the German additional footage, because I do think that needs to be preserved and included in future releases of this film. That's the one thing I wish had been here, really. Now, to talk about the audio, it is presented in its original mono form in DTS HDMA lossless quality, and all I have to compare with is the old DVD, which, like the 31 version, the old DVD is very murky, very muddy sounding. It doesn't sound very good. It's like it's got a bunch of noise reduction and EQ applied to it. So this is a night and day dramatic improvement. I don't have any of the older releases. It didn't have, the 41 version never got a fancy Laserdisc or anything. So all I have to compare is the DVD and Blu-ray. So on that basis alone, the audio is a dramatic upgrade in clarity, presence, and you can basically just now ignore the DVD because that didn't sound good for either version, really. What you will notice, though, while it sounds clearer, there is a little bit of distortion here and there. There is a little bit of hiss that seems to be intrinsic to the source. So I don't mind that when that's, obviously on a film of this era, you're going to run into that at some point. But I did notice several spots of noticeable distortion in addition to usual sort of wear and hiss and things. There's also a spot where there seems to be a tiny slight stutter for a frame or two that does sort of mess with one of the words in a line of dialogue, but that seems to be intrinsic to the source, because it's almost like there's a little bit of the soundtrack missing, or there was a pop or something, or some bit of damage that unfortunately made a tiny slight stutter in the audio track. But that, again, seems to be intrinsic to the source and nothing they could really do anything about. Then there is also a little bit of harshness that creeps into the track here and there, very fleetingly, but mostly in the high end and in some of the musical cues, which, again, is going to be pretty intrinsic to a source of this era from the early 1940s. Depending on how it was recorded and preserved and stored, and it seems to have probably been there all this time since the original release. So again, all that stuff seems to be intrinsic to the source, so there's nothing really you can do about that. And I would always much rather have signs of the age of the film and the age and preservation status than somebody going to town with crazy amounts of noise reduction and equalizing and really ruining the audio presentation, as unfortunately happens to so many films. So if there's a little bit of harshness and there's a little bit of age-related wear, I'm fine with that, because that's how it should be. You shouldn't try to hide these things by literally going in and trying to remanipulate and destroy the original audio presentation. So you will notice some bits of distortion and some general harshness here and there, but that's really to be expected. So I do think it is a dramatic improvement in the audio as well over the DVD. Now, to talk about the packaging and extras, the packaging is the standard Warner Archive simple case with original poster art. This is beautifully produced, so the color really looks nice on the white background. The spine actually does specify this is the 41 version, so when you have them side by side on the shelf with the 31 version, you can easily know which one you're grabbing off the shelf. That was a nice touch. They didn't have to do that, but it's really nice and helpful that they did. The rear is in the new standard Warner Archive style with images and then the different colors sort of mimicking colors from the poster. And then the disc itself carries the same artwork as the poster. Now, unfortunately, there are no new extras here, and all you get is the original trailer. However, they have scanned the trailer in HD, so it's I always really enjoy it when you can see an original trailer in high quality. And most of the time, trailers are included in their old standard def scans from years ago in the video era. So not only did they include the trailer, but they actually scanned it in HD, and it's a little worn, but at least it looks much better than I've ever seen it before. And if you're going to include the trailer, that's what you should do, is do a new HD scan so the trailer actually looks good instead of looking like absolute crud, as unfortunately most trailers are stuck. So it's unfortunate that they didn't get to do any new extras, but that's pretty common for the archive. I do wish they had been able to do a commentary. I think somebody could do a really interesting commentary on this and make a lot of comparisons to the 31 version, talk about Tracy's performance and Fleming's direction and the strengths of the MGM adaptation. So that would be my one sort of the thing I wish had happened on this, that they have been able to commission a commentary as well. So those are my thoughts on the Warner Archive release of the MGM 1941 remake of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think it's been overshadowed always, really since its original release, by the 1931 version, with good reason, because it's nowhere near as good or as effective of a film experience. The 1931 version does remain the standard classic version of Stevenson's original story on the screen. It is the best film made from Jekyll and Hyde, even though it does take a lot from the stage play and isn't quite doing the original novella as written. But there are important things in the 41 version. I think it still plays pretty well, and there is the wow factor of the MGM full high gloss big production values at their sort of peak of production in the early 40s. I think Tracy's performance is really magnificent when it really is allowed to get going. I think he makes a really striking Hyde, and I like the psychological aspects in both his performance and Ingrid Bergman's performance, who is also wonderful as this film's version of Ivy, even though the whole story and the whole script is unbelievably toned down from the 1931 version. So it is definitely, it is the definition of a tamer adaptation for sure. It being made under the auspices of the production code really did hurt its overall effectiveness, and I do think they should have made their own new adaptation instead of trying to do an extraordinarily watered down remake of the 31 version. But all that being said, it is beautifully directed by Victor Fleming. It is wonderfully shot by Joseph Rutenberg. It has full MGM production values, and this new transfer is absolutely beautiful. So you can put this disc on and wow people who don't get into black and white films. It is a beautiful disc. It does rival UHD titles. It is the usual standard wonderful encoding job from Warner Archive, maxed out bitrate, and even though it doesn't have a lot of extras, the asking price, the list price, is very cheap, and if you get the 31 version, you're going to want to look at the 41 version. So it was wonderful of them to do both versions in the same year, so you can buy both and do the usual double feature, because you can't really think about one without thinking about the other, and you'll always want to go and watch the other film. If you pick one to watch, you want to watch both of them and do a new comparison. They kind of go hand in hand in that sense. And I do think this is one of the Archive's best discs of 2022, even though it doesn't have really any extras. And I think the strength of the new scan and the fact that the film actually does have some strengths to it that frequently get overlooked or aren't discussed, I think it's a beautiful disc presentation. This was my best experience ever seeing this film, because I too had kind of written it off before. I had only seen it once or twice, and it was a long time ago, and so I was kind of going, why do I really want to watch this tonight? And I put it on, and I just got into the spirit of the film, even though it is a watered down experience. So there's no getting around it's a weaker film, but I think the Archive has done another beautiful job. I think this is another of their must-own discs because it's so well done, and this gets you that full MGM high production value that will never be achieved again in Hollywood. So those are my thoughts on the Archive's release on Blu-ray of the 1941 MGM version of Jekyll and Hyde. I think it's a fascinating film to come to and look at and study, and it's never been as beautiful looking on home video as this new release. It is, I think, an easy upgrade without question in picture and sound. You can now easily get rid of your older copies. I think the only issue is that they weren't able to get any of that additional footage from that German version that's floating around. So hopefully, if there is ever a reissue or a 4K upgrade for this, they might be able to do that and perhaps commission a new commentary. But until then, this is a remarkable upgrade, and I think another must-own title from the Archive this year in 2022. So as always, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. And if you love the 41 version as much as some people seem to, I would love to hear your thoughts, because it's a fascinating comparison to make, and it's always interesting to hear people talk positively instead of the usual negative discussion about the 41 version. And as I always like to say, keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep physical media alive. And thanks ever so much for watching.